Good evening, I'm Fred Green. I'm a graduate from 1954 of Royal Oak High, and I'm introducing myself right now because most of you know who I am, but I'm doing it for the video. And I can't tell you how pleasurable it is for me to be here this evening to talk to the Royal Oak Historical Association, of which I am proud to say I am a part of, and to reminisce that 70 years ago, I first sat in this schoolroom in grade 1 and dipped Reenie Heel's braids in the back of the inkwell that she sat behind me until she complained, the ungrateful wretch. I think her mother caught her braids when she was braiding them in the morning because they were beautifully braided hair, and saw the ink. And I was given heck by Miss Adamson, who was the teacher, and Reenie was moved, and it broke my heart. But anyway, it takes me back 70 years, and I can't believe if anybody had said to me that I would be here 70 years later addressing this august body of people, I'd have said, you're absolutely nuts. There's no way that's going to happen. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here this evening, and I'm really enjoying it. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about my family. I won't spend too much time doing that. My father's family came from Norfolk, England, and they were a farming family from Snettisham-on-the-Wash, which is in East Anglia, about 120 miles north of London. And they were a large family. His name, oddly enough, was Fred Green, and there were 13 children. And there were 4 daughters, and there were 9 sons. And my dad, Ivan, was the youngest, and he was called Chick for the rest of his life. They all had nicknames, but he was called Chick. My grandfather, Fred Green, was a wheelwright by trade, a carpenter, a farmer, a lay Wesleyan minister, preacher, who used to go on circuit around preaching on Sundays. And my grandmother was, Bessie Green, was a school teacher and was an Anglican, a very devout Anglican. Sunday mornings must have been, or Sundays were a horror show for the Green family because they started off with Sunday school in the morning at 9, chapel in the Wesleyan chapel at 11, and evensong in the Anglican church at night, with usually the Anglican minister or the Wesleyan minister, if it was a traveling minister, for lunch. And of course, you can imagine the conversations and the sermons being discussed and that sort of thing. She was a very strong lady, and at the age of 62 in 1912, Fred Green decided that he would emigrate to Canada, where his eldest daughter was living, Victoria, with her husband, to give his boys a chance. They were apprenticed out to various trades in London, grocers, chemists, draper's shop, and that sort of thing, but he didn't really see a future for them in England. So at 62, this old boy, with 7 of the boys came with him, and one of the daughters, the unmarried daughter, who Jack will remember as Aunt Kate, who lived with Uncle Harold for the rest of her life, she lived to be about 100. They came out to Quebec City by steamship, and then rode the colonist train from Quebec City to Vancouver in colonist chairs, wooden slatted chairs, sat up the whole way 5 days and 5 nights into Vancouver, and then over here to Victoria. They hit Victoria in 1912 in the middle of an unbelievable boom. And when you think of Ardmore as it is today, and all the subdivision in Ardmore and all the homes, that subdivision was completely surveyed and laid out in 1912. And there was a tremendous boom of real property investment and building going on in Victoria at that particular time. My grandfather Fred, together with my dad, who then was only 14 but refused to go to school once he got out here, and Harold, who was slightly older, and Stan, Stan was in Australia, and another one of the uncles, decided to go into building spec houses in this land boom. And Fred Green came out with a sizable chunk of change from selling the farms and all the equipment in Norfolk. And he managed in 2 years, when World War I started and the boom just absolutely crashed, to lose every penny that he had. And he would be then, at that point in time, about 64, going on 65. He and his wife, Bessie, from that point on, for the rest of their lives, were looked after by basically the 3 younger boys in the family, because there was no old age security, there was no welfare, you were on your own, and so your family looked after you. The family was very close, and the 7 uncles that were here in the Victoria area, their homes were like a second home to John and I and Helen. We went back and forth. If you came home after school and one of them, you happened to end up at one of the uncles' homes, Uncle Harold or Uncle Stan's, you just went into the kitchen and got out a loaf of bread and cut off a piece of bread and had a piece of bread and butter. It was just like your second home. It was a wonderful, wonderful time for us as kids to have all these uncles and aunts who were very, very close to us. Uncle Harold taught me an awful lot in terms of farming and running equipment and tractors. My dad, carpentry work. And Uncle Stan, by this time, was the assessor for Saanich here in the old Med Grill, which was the old municipal hall, gave me, although he was a fine finished carpenter as well, gave me a love for the sea. And he and I used to go fishing, and he taught me how to fish for salmon out off Saanich and Spit. And we would fish in a 14-foot clinker boat with a little air-cooled Kohler engine. In those days, you never fished with anything more than a 3-ounce weight and a couch and spoon or a small fly, and you never came home without your limit in fish. And in the late summer, September, early October, when the coho were running, that Saanich Bay was 1.5 feet underneath your boat, was just a silver sea of fish. It was unbelievable. Whatever have we done? Anyway, my mother and her family came from England, and Jack spoke a little bit about it because we have joint maternal grandparents, Joe Taylor and Ellen Taylor, and they came out to Canada from Manchester. My mother was born in Manchester. Jack's mum, Winifred, was born in Moose Jaw, as he told us before, and they eventually found their way to Victoria as well. And my paternal grandfather, Joe Taylor, was an accountant, and basically from his arrival in Canada from about 1913 on, was mainly an accountant in the forestry industry, as was one of his grandsons, Jack Mather, who was mainly an accountant largely in the forestry industry before he became a farmer, as he told you all who were here last month. My brother John and Helen, who are here tonight to make sure that I behave myself, are both graduates of Royal Oak High School as well. And we moved as a family to the farm in Elk Lake in about October of 1942. And I say October because it becomes important a little bit later in my narrative. I'm going to tell you a little bit, because a lot of you are far younger than I am. You will not remember, perhaps, in the war years here from 42 on. I can't say that I remember an awful lot, but I'm going to tell you the things that I do remember. I remember, first of all, on December 7th, 41, Pearl Harbor being invaded and the terrible gloom in our home with that announcement. And then when we came out here in 1942, I remember David Gen's dad was in charge of the ARP wardens. And there was a system of what was called ARP wardens set up, because not long before that, after Japan declared war, and we declared war on Japan, a Japanese submarine is said to have surfaced off, I think it was Hewlett or Sheringham Point, somewhere there, and is said to have shelled Vancouver Island. There's some dispute about that, whether that really happened, but that was the common version anyway at that time. And as well, the Japanese were sending over fire bombs, and they would let loose these high-altitude balloons from the Japanese home islands, and the winds, upper winds, and the jet stream would carry these things, and it did, carry these things over to the west coast, and the idea was that these fire bombs would drop into our forests and burn our forests. I think some did, but they didn't cause any damage much. But as a result of those concerns, we had this ARP system, and all our houses had to have blackout curtains on them. At night, you could not have the slightest crack of light showing outside your house. If you did, there'd be a bang, and Nori remembers this, there'd be a bang on your door from the ARP warden saying, your light's showing, be sure you cover up that light. The wardens, I think they had stirrup pumps, as I recall, and there was a helmet, and some of them packed gas masks as well. They were gas, yeah. And the cars, their headlights only had little tiny slits for light, so you couldn't see very much. And we had gas rationing, we had food rationing, tea, coffee, sugar, butter, all in short supply. And you could only get what your ration card would give you, or if you were on the dark side, what you could get on the black market. But we never talked about those sort of activities. I'll never forget, and the farm, because lunches were the big meals on the farm, I'll never forget the huge cans of pilchards, canned pilchards on the dining room table that we used to have to eat. And they're a large, large herring. And to this day, I can't stand herring or pilchards of any sort whatsoever. I hated them. What is now the Elk Lake and Beaver Park along the highway, and the highway then was just a fairly narrow two-lane East Saanich Road, was an Army training ground. And I primarily remember that as an Army training ground for Bren gun carriers. And I can remember Bren gun carriers flying up and down those areas and bouncing up and down, and they were training. And the Bren gun carrier was a fairly light tracked vehicle. It was open. It carried about 5 or 6 soldiers, packed a Bren gun, which was really just a .303 machine gun, and was powered, the quarter milers will be happy to know, by a flathead V8, Ford V8, and that was its main power. And it also helped it in action become a gas bomb, and an explosive bomb as well. So that's what I remember from the war years from 1942 until 1945. The farm that we came to was about, as near as I can remember and put together, 45 acres. And in the mid-30s, 4 of my uncles, including my dad, they all got together and they bought that acreage from Tom Amos, who was Sheila Amos's father. And so, as I recollect, and my memory's a little bit fuzzy on it, I remember that they didn't pay, I think they paid about $100 an acre, no more, for that property. It, of course, had been clear-cut in the early 1900s, but was now fairly well forested with second growth trees, and which Jack, the old logger, will say, "And property so, and what are you concerned about with all this clear cutting?" But anyway, there was from about the mid-30s on, which is before my time, they've gradually cleared various areas of that land. Uncle Stan sort of appropriated about 16 acres and built his house there on that. And Uncle Harold had the other acreages, and 2 other uncles who gradually sold their interests had property running pretty well from Walima right down to what was then the McIntyre and Harding gravel pit and is now the Trio gravel pit. And those were the areas that John and Helen and I and Jack, we grew up in, both worked on as we grew older and played in as we were young as kids, because there was a lot of bush and we played in a lot of bush, and it was great. It was fantastic. There was no municipal water. We lived in the early war years with my Uncle Harold and Aunt Kate in their house. There was no municipal water. The house, as I recall, it had a full basement, but it had a great huge concrete cistern system inside it for catching rainwater. I can't remember how we pumped the water up into the house, but there must have been some means of doing that. We did have electricity. The farm truck, and I've got some pictures here when I'm through, we'll show you around. It was a 2-ton 1936 Ford farm truck, an ex-lumber truck with a long deck on it. We would put on it a 500-gallon water tank, and we would drive down to the McIntyre and Harding gravel pit, 2 or 3 times a week, fill it up with water there, and bring it back to water the cattle and the chickens that we had on the farm. I started driving that farm truck when I was about 8 in the hayfields, and I'd have to stand up and hang onto the steering wheel to be able to see outside, driving between the haycocks. And gradually, by the time I was 11 or 12, I was driving the truck fully as you would drive it, taking great pride in double clutching and shifting and getting the revs just right and driving this truck around. And by that age, much to my mother's chagrin, my dad would let me drive that truck on the roads around Santa Clara and Del Monte. And you remember that, Helen, don't you? Yes, I'm going to tell the story. So anyway, one day with I can still hear my mother saying, "Ivan, don't let him do it." I was tasked with driving the truck from our place on Del Monte Avenue round through to Santa Clara and up to the farm on the other side. And it would be about a 3/4 of a mile drive, I suppose, not much more than that. Helen and John were in the truck beside me, and I was driving. And as we approached the farm gate on Santa Clara, which the farm ran up, and you'll see it in the picture that I've got there, there was a long driveway and a long big fence that came all the way down with big fence posts on either side. The truck, being an ex-lumber truck, had a fairly wide deck extension out beyond the cab. And I'm concentrating on doing smooth shifts as I come around, sail around this corner. I'm not going to stop and creep around. I'm going to keep on going and just shift her down. And I miscalculate, and bang, we hit the fence. There's a shriek and a yell. Your head hit the metal dashboard with a great thump, and you started yelling and screaming, Helen. And John was saying to me, "What have you done?" I was mortified. The fence is gradually going down like this all the way up the hill. And in any event, they didn't stick up for me. When they went running up to the house, crying and screaming, they said it was all my fault, and I felt very hard done by. But you know, the uncles and my dad were really, really good with us kids. They didn't get mad at you. They just said, "Well, you'll know better next time, and you haven't done too much damage. You're going to have to help us fix the fence, but the truck is fine. It'll last. It hasn't been wrecked. It was an old truck anyway." But those are some of the sort of things we were able to do as kids during that particular era. On the farm, we had anywhere from 20 to 25 milk cows. We had 2 double-decker chicken houses, double-decker chicken houses. And we were trying, John and I over dinner, we're trying to figure out how many chickens we had there. And we came to the conclusion probably a total of about 500 to 600 laying hens in those 2 double-decker chicken houses. And one of our jobs as young boys on the farm was to clean, they had dropping boards, roosts and dropping boards, was to clean the dropping boards. And those of you who had small chicken houses or worked in large chicken ranches, you'll know what kind of a job that is and what kind of a state you are when you come out from that chicken house. So that was one of our jobs we used to have to do. We had pigs. We spent a lot of time collecting eggs, candling eggs, cleaning eggs, and all that sort of thing. Milking cows, I can remember with absolute delight when the first De Laval milking machine arrived, and we no longer had to hand milk. We still had to strip, but we no longer had to hand milk. We grew up cleaning out the barn, shoveling out the manure, liming the barn, and that sort of thing. And also, one of the worst jobs that we could have on that farm was hand hoeing the mangle field that was just outside the house. It would be about an acre. Now, I was the kind of guy that liked driving mechanical things, but I did not like hard physical work particularly. And I remember I dreaded and detested the time I had to spend weeding these mangles. Time seemed to just drag by like an eternity. It was just awful. So we used to do that sort of thing for silage. At about 10 or 11 or so, Uncle Harold brought home a pony called Johnny. And Johnny was about a 14 to 15-year-old pony. He stood about 12 and a half to 13 hands. He'd come from the Carley riding stables, and he was an old hand dealing with new hands, let me tell you. And so when you tried to take Johnny for a ride, Johnny usually took you for the ride. And when we first started with him, we were not allowed to have a saddle. We had to ride bareback because the obvious thing was we were going to be falling off and we didn't want to be dragged by the stirrup. And we used to spend quite a bit of time going over along Del Monte to Walter Polson's place, who was the uncle to the Polson kids that Brian and Malcolm that we knew down from the road by Elk Lake, where the stand of trees still are, where their house used to be. And but once I got off Johnny, I wasn't able to get back on unless I could maneuver him up to a stump, and so that I could hop on a stump and then I could get back onto Johnny. Well, Johnny was wise to that, and every time I'd step up to get onto Johnny, Johnny would shy away, and down I'd go. And it would be a continual battle to try and get on Johnny to get myself home. But those are the sort of things that went on. What is now Silver Rill Farm was our dry farm. We called it Shady Creek Farm. And that is where we would send our heifers and our dry cows out, and we also made hay. And a lot of time was spent out there with working those fields. Now at this point in time, and I'm talking about 44, yeah, about 44, we were still using horses. We had a team of horses, a Percheron called Bob and a Clyde called Bill. And I can remember driving those horses in the Silver Rill Farm area, and about where the Silver Rill Market is right now was an orchard, and it had apple trees in it. And I've got this team of horses that I'm driving, and I'm quite proud of myself. I'm driving them with a binder. Do you all know what a binder is, with the big wooden hoops that go around? Well, you know what's going to happen, don't you? I ended up driving those horses through the apple orchard, and I smacked every single wooden thing on the binder off. Again, the uncles and my father were pretty good. One of the most scary things I think that I ever saw during that period of time involved a hired man. And I'll just say a quick word about hired men. In those days, all the farms had what we called hired men. And I remember two very vividly from my childhood. The first one was named Watty, and the second one we called Mr. Butt. His name was Richard Butt. But Watty, and they were generally quite refined English bachelors of an indeterminate age, but I'd say somewhere in the mid to late 50s on. And they lived in a little shack on our property, and they ate all their meals with us. And the conversations at mealtime would really be quite interesting. In any event, Watty, this hired man, was driving the horses out at Shady Creek at Silver Rill with a big, huge iron horse rake. And 18 feet wide with big iron hoop wheels like that. And Bob the Percheron was the flighty one, and Watty, who was slightly arthritic, walked up the center pole to adjust the harness or the halter on Bob. He must have stumbled because he startled Bob, and these two horses, this team just took off on a dead gallop around this large field that ran then across where the highway is now, right over to the other side. It's quite some distance. And it was just, and the ground was hard packed as can be. And I can recall these horses galloping round and round and round. My dad was there. Uncle Harold finally decided to try and stop. We could see Watty's legs dangling between the center pole. He decided to try and stop the team. So he ran out, was able to get hold of the halter of Bob, and Bob took him around the field 3 or 4 times, and Uncle Harold couldn't slow him down, and he realized he wasn't going to be able to hang on much longer either. He also realized he had the huge rake out there behind him, behind the team, ready to gather him up when he fell off. Well, he tried to fling himself clear, and I can still see him flinging himself clear of these horses. And then he just about made it, but the iron ring of the rake ran over his head. And I can see him going up in the air, feet and head touching. It seemed like about 15 feet and coming down. No ambulances in those days. And the horses, if you can believe it, after that slowed down and stopped. But no ambulance. My dad had to pack him into the car and drive him into the Jubilee Hospital from way out there at Shady Creek. He was in hospital for at least 6 weeks or so, and I guess in bed for a couple of months when he got home. Never really recovered from that accident, but it just shows you what can happen even with horses in those days on the farm. Taking us back to here, where Gary Milner's dad had the gas station was, in my day, a blacksmith shop. And it was run by a man called Percy Waterhouse. And I can remember going down to that blacksmith shop and watching horses being shoed, watching shoes being made, watching the bellows being heated up and tools being made and that sort of thing. And I also remember we used to hay the Maltwoods fields over here at the fireside. They owned the malt, and we heard from somebody giving us a talk on Mrs. Maltwood about 3 or 4 months ago. And he was a crusty old man. I don't care how nice our speaker said Mrs. Maltwood was, he was crusty. And I can remember him stomping around, and he would say to my father, "Well, Green," And my father would say right back to him, "Well, Malthouse," and Malthouse did not like being referred to in that way at all. So I remember that very well. The first tractor that we got arrived on the scene just before the end of the war, and it was what we called a homemade tractor. And I think, do you know where Hill's Chocolates are and where the Island View freezer used to be? Joan certainly will, out there, and it's out, how's my best way to describe it? What's that? The road runs down toward Mitchell's shop. Island View Road. There was a Hafer machine shop there. And that was a fantastic place. And in fact, Rodney Hafer, I certainly went to school with him at Mount Newton. Did he go to Royal Oak? I'm not quite sure if he did or not, but I remember him very well. Anyway, his dad and an uncle ran Hafer's machine shop, and they built all kinds of things. In those days, you didn't have farm equipment places like you have now, not at least in southern part of Saanich. And they would build harrows, they would build spring-toothed harrows, they would build anything you wanted, and they would also, from scratch, and they would also build homemade tractors. And they would get old cars, cut the frame in half, shorten it up. I don't know what they did with the transmission, but they may have changed the ratio in the gearbox or something to get the low drive. Darrell and Jack would know more about that than I do. And they'd put a big set of oversized tires, not that big, on the rear, and regular car tires on the front. And there was your homemade tractor. And that was what was our tractor as the horses gradually went. That was the tractor that we used on the farm. Still pulling the horse implements. So our mower would be a horse mower. Our rake was still being used. The infamous rake would still be towed behind the tractor. And then towards the end of the war, or just after the war, we ended up getting a little Ford tractor. We thought that was just fantastic. It had the 3-point Ferguson hitch on it, so you could raise it up and down. Renee knows it well because she drove one at the same time, exactly the same. And that was just fantastic. I was in seventh heaven because I was given pretty well free rein with that tractor, and I did a lot of work with the tractor. So did John and so did Jack later on, but I, being older, had the first dibs at that tractor. And there were a lot of stumps left and trees to be cleared at that point in time on the property. And you'll see a picture after I'm through speaking that shows the farm pretty well cleared. Well, in 1945, it really wasn't quite that cleared. And the provincial government or the federal government, I don't really know which, were giving farmers grants to clear their land. And they also had, I think, the cats were also, I think, paid for by the government, and if not contracted by the government to do the work. In any event, it's a small world. Great big cat arrives, the equivalent to what I'd call a D8 cat now. I don't know if they had D8 cats then, and to me it looked like a monster cat, with the cat skinner. And the cat skinner, the driver, was a big burly guy with a great big cigar in his mouth, and his name was Bob Amos, Sheila Amos's brother, and the son of the guy that we'd bought the property from. And I can remember watching in awe as this tractor worked away, cleaning up all the stuff. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself because there were stumps left. And John and I, at ages, what, John, 10 and 11, roughly, would be sent out with a box of stumping powder, a coil of fuse, and a box of caps, having been briefed very carefully on the danger of caps, and a trenching shovel for digging underneath the stumps, because our job was to blow these stumps up so they could be all rounded up by the cat and put into great huge piles and burned. Well, we had a field day. Now, the only admonition we got, apart from a really stern lecture on being careful with caps and how they could blow your hand off, was that if it doesn't go off after you've lit the fuse, don't you go back down there and try and fix it. You come and get us. Well, things went pretty well. We blew a lot of stumps and had a lot of fun making great big bangs. Until one day, I recall, John and I got a little bit over exuberant. We were not far from the new house that Dad had just built for us on Del Monte Avenue, and we put too big a charge under one big old stump, And the next thing I know is Mother's at the kitchen window, and a great huge piece of stump comes flying up and thwangs up against the side of the house. Well, we got heck for that, and we're told to reduce our loads after that, not to put so much stuff underneath the stumps. Anyway, after that was done, rounded up by the burly cat skinner I referred to, we had huge bonfires to burn up all this debris. And we used to roast hamburgers, hot dogs, and that kind of stuff in the embers of these great big fires. Then, of course, came the fun work. I got the job with a single plow and the new Ford tractor to break the land, because this land was virgin land, it had never been broken before. And so I had a great time plowing these fields to break the land, hitting boulders, hitting roots, hitting what was left of the stumps. And then the nasty hard work came for people like John and I think Jack may have got on this, Norrie might have too, I don't sure. We had stone bolts that we towed, a stone bolt we towed behind the tractor, and we had to pick rocks. And oh man, that was an awful job, picking rocks. So that's what we had to do there. And we basically cleared the land, so the farm ran between Santa Clara Avenue and Del Monte Avenue. And there was a fair distance across when you used to walk it or that sort of thing between the two houses. So by the age of 10 and 11, I was becoming pretty good on that tractor. And I would rather use machinery than use my hands, even if it took an awful lot longer to do the job, to the frustration of my father on many occasions. The bush was our playground as well, but I'll hit that in a moment. So I became pretty good. I used to plow the silver rill and took a lot of pride in plowing. And if anybody told me what are some of the most delightful memories that I remember from that period of time, there are two. It's the smell of the ground as you break those furrows and you're laying a beautiful straight furrow down the line, and the smell of the new mown hay as you're mowing it behind the tractor. Those are two smells that to this day I still can remember, and remember fondly, those smells. In any event, the bush, when we weren't working, was our playground, because there was still lots of bush. And George Winterburn and Peter Goddard, we used to all, and Norrie, the Spencer boys, and my brother, the bush was our playground. We spent our time playing around the bush, cowboys and Indians and this sort of thing. BB guns, we were never allowed to have, but there were BB guns and that sort of thing. And then a little bit later on, still a lot of bush around. George Winterburn and I remember, I don't know where we got it, but we got hold of a .22 rifle with a scope. And he and, hey?
Probably George.
Yeah, probably. And we used to go out with this .22 rifle, and imagine doing that now in the middle of which is now a subdivision. And 22, even a short, will carry a good mile. We used to go out with this .22 rifle shooting robins. And blasting robins out of the cherry trees and that sort of thing. Had a great time. Well, you know, what kid for the last 45 or 50 years even could do that in this part of the world? It was just really another world. One of my favorite jobs was well, we had the Silver Rill farm, was loading up the manure spreader on Saturday mornings at the farm at Elk Lake. And by doing that, I was able to drive the tractor and the manure spreader out to the Silver Rill farm, Shady Creek Farm. And it was still the old East Highway. It wasn't the new Pat Bay Highway. And there was a little bit, even a steeper hill where the hill is now going down below to Martindale Road. There was a much steeper hill. And what I used to do is throw the old tractor into neutral, and with the weight of the manure spreader behind me, I could get that old girl just really going. The wheel would be going like this, and there was no way I'd ever stop that thing if I ever had put the brakes on. And I even passed a couple of cars once. But anyway, I had great fun until one day my dad was behind me. I didn't know it. He saw me do it, and you can recognize the result. I never ever did that again, but it was just great fun. We used to pick strawberries, and I remember picking strawberries so well at our place. Our property sort of inside the farm was about 3 acres, and the money was scarce. And so my mother would grow strawberries. And we'd have about an acre or so of strawberries, acre and a half of strawberries. Local kids would come and pick the strawberries. Dad and I and John would hoe them. And the money that Mom got from them, would buy her things. Like I remember the first electric stove coming to the house. It was an Acme electric stove. We thought it was just wonderful. Next year it was a British India rug for the living room. The following year it was a dining room suite bought from the Woods, who had that heart plant farm out here in central Saanich. And so that's the way they used to make their extra money. And when the strawberries sort of went out, we went to Loganberries. On the corner of Halliburton Road and the highway now, up a little bit on the old road, was where the Saanich fruit growers' shed was. And we used to deliver all our strawberries and loganberries to how will I describe her? A masterful lady named Mrs. Tyler, who, yeah, you remember her, Peter? Oh boy, and she ruled the roost. And if you brought a crate of strawberries in or a crate of loganberries in that weren't up to par, she'd say to my dad, "Ivan, those aren't very good. I don't think I want to take those." Not that we did that very often, but whenever that happened. And I'll tell you a story. One day we had septic tanks, of course, in those days, and there was a fairly good slope running down through our strawberry patch. And we had one particular area of strawberries that grew the most magnificent berries you could ever see. And they were big, luscious things. So these were packed into the flat that we arrived at the fruit shed this one day with Mrs. Tyler. And she takes a look at these. "Oh my, Ivan," she said, "aren't these wonderful strawberries? I think I'll have one." She didn't like the taste of those very much. And "Where did you get those?" she said. My father remained quite silent. He just said, "Out of the strawberry patch." That's all he basically said. But then fairly quickly early on, as things were declining, because this is part of the story I'm telling, the decline of agriculture in this area, that fruit shed closed up, and we had to bring, by the time we were growing loganberries, we had to bring them out to the Saanich fruit shed out there on Keating, and we used to bring them out there. But apart from that, we used to also, all of us, Helen, I don't know if you did. Did you pick strawberries for the heels? I don't remember. Loganberries, I mean, for the heels. Yeah. So all three of us picked loganberries for Reenie's dad, Bob Heel. And he was a very nice, forgiving, quiet, tolerant man. That's all I can basically say. And John was the champion picker of loganberries. He picked fast, but his flats didn't look very good. They were mashed up and bashed up. And Bob Heel would say, "Oh, John," he said, "you know, you've done a real good job filling up the flats, but you've got to be a bit more careful with those berries." Whereas Fred was very meticulous and was as slow as molasses, but picked very nice crates or flats of loganberries. And so that loganberry patch and Reenie's old family home was where there is now the church up just below the cemetery, and their patch ran right through across what is now the main road down below the bottom of the cemetery. And Reenie's grandmother lived in a big grand home that was surrounded by loganberries and that sort of thing, now all just houses. And I can remember her driving her black electric Model T car. Black. And I checked it with Reenie tonight, and she confirmed my memory was correct. That is what Mrs. Heel drove. So even then, the electric car was in vogue, and we're talking 1948, 49, somewhere in there. Yeah. So by the early 50s, my dad, who had worked the farm with my Uncle Harold, Stan was by now the assessor and collector for Saanich, he had become basically a building contractor by day, and a part-time farmer out of economic necessity. And farming, though, was always his passion. And I've told you about the 3 acres that we had around our place and the strawberries and logans that we grew, but we also always had, while Dad was still working full-time as a small building contractor, in fact, he built Reenie's home by the strawberry patch when I was a young boy. We used to always have about 500 broiler chickens. We used to have 2 or 3 pigs on occasion that we fed constantly, and used to string them up under a great big boiling barrel of hot water to skin them and that sort of thing when they were to be slaughtered. And we also grew the loganberries, as I've said. When I started Royal Oak High, grade 11 and 12, and I'm going to talk about the schools in just a moment, I was pretty much away from working on the farm. John was taking over, Jack was taking over, and I was by this time working weekends and Nori too. But you see, I wasn't there, so I didn't know all these things much. I was working full weekends at BC Forest Products Plywood Mill on the gorge, cleaning dryers. And I was working, interestingly enough, 3 afternoons a week after school while going to Royal Oak here at the Nuns Chinchilla Farm, cleaning out the chinchillas, Norman nuns. I used to clean out their chinchillas. But I was pretty flush those days. I was making quite a bit of money, and I had no expenses. And I had acquired a girlfriend in Oak Bay, at Oak Bay High, and I'd also acquired a friend, our minister's son, who was fresh out from Toronto. And you know what they say about minister's son? Well, in this particular case, it's all true. And he was a boy from the big city, let me tell you, and he was also a fashion plate. So before very long, and I don't think anybody here remembers it, sadly, I was appearing at Royal Oak High School in tailor-made drapes, 2717s, with a French seam down the side, usually powder blue, with a blue belt and blue suede shoes. And I imagined that I cut quite the figure, but and I was paying from them myself, because what happened was, and this leads into the story about the, and shut me up, am I going on for too long? This leads into the story about the, I'm not hearing no, so I'll cut it off pretty quick. The story about me getting a paper route. My mother every September used to take us down into W&J Wilson's, and the lower floor was children's clothing. And my mother, being of English background, dressed us in the English public school style, which was a gray flannel shirt, a striped tie, a tweed jacket, and tweed shorts, long black socks, and black boots that had to be polished every morning before we went to school. And I suffered through this and the taunts and arrows thrown at us by our fellow students up till about the end of grade 6, just before I was heading for Mount Newton. And I'm down there in Wilson's, and this whole procedure is starting again, and I throw a hissy fit, and I say, "That's it, I'm not wearing these clothes, that's it, we're done." And she said to me, "As long as I'm paying for your clothes, you'll wear what I tell you to wear." And try getting away with that these days, eh? Anyway, so I said, fine, I'm going to buy my own clothes. And by that afternoon, I had a paper route with the Times Colonist. Used to pick up my papers at the old Saanich fruit shed at the corner of Haliburton. I bought, the roads were all gravel where we lived, Santa Clara and Del Monte, and Haliburton was paved, but the rest of the roads were gravel. So I had a big super balloon CCM bike, and it used to take an hour and a half to deliver 36 papers along that route. And that's how I started with a paper route. In any event, it just amazes me how everything has been eaten up by subdivisions, and our old farm is now just a very intense and very dense subdivision. Friends in the area, friends and families in the area, I remember so fondly. The Goddards, the Tuckies, the Varleys, the Minters, the Swifts, the Winterburns, the Coopers, the Polsons, the Bramwells, where I bought my first motorcycle, and I still ride a motorcycle, and the Spencers and the Bowden Greens. I remember Deanna's dad and mom arriving very well, building their house. He was a manager at the Hudson's Bay in the Garden Supply Center, and I won a scholarship in my second year of Vic College and to the Hudson's Bay. And I remember I used to get rides into work every morning with your dad and your mom to the Hudson's Bay. But in any event, I remember all those people so well and remember them so fondly. Quickly, I'll get on to school days. I had a checkered career at school. I started off in the September of '42 at Cloverdale for a week. And then I did about 3.5 weeks at the little one-room school in Cedar Hill. And then we moved out from Union Avenue, where we were living, which is Vicky's stamping ground, moved out from Union Avenue to the farm, and I started in this little one-room school here in about October. And Ms. Adamson was the teacher. It was grade 1. George Varley was in my grade, and I remember, because I was still wearing those short pants and those long socks and the boots, I arrived here, and I can still remember the fields sort of around the area around this schoolhouse being met as a new boy arriving 6 weeks into the school term, and being initiated by George, which involved being chased around the schoolyard until he caught me, and then well and truly pummeled until he was satisfied, and after that we were the best of friends. But that was the initiation. Apart from dipping Reenie's braids in the inkwell, the only other thing I got into trouble for was, and I can remember it, skipping down the steps, which are much taller than they are now, with music. We must have been singing in something or doing something, and I think somebody was there to pick me up, and I let the music go and didn't bother to pick it up. And the next morning when I arrived, Miss Adamson flung the music at me and said, "Hold out your hand," and the inevitable happened. I got strapped, and that was about the only time I got strapped, I think. Soccer, we used to play soccer on the field between here and the big school. It was the Fords and the Chevs. The teams were the Fords and the Chevs. The Varleys were always part of the Ford team, as was I. I don't remember a lot of the Chev team, except for one guy, Earl Mycock. And Earl Mycock was a stocky kind of a guy, and he played a mean game of soccer, and he could shin hack. And my shins to this day are variegated like that due to the expertise of Earl's shin hacking. I'll never forget that. I remember the sports days. We used to go down the Pipeline Road to Beaver Lake and the tarmac there and have our sports days there. And then there was Mrs. Walsh. How many of you know Mrs. Walsh? Do a lot of you know Mrs. Walsh? Yes, the older ones know Mrs. Walsh. Well, Mrs. Walsh and I didn't really get on, and I hit grade 5 with Mrs. Walsh, and my mother and Mrs. Walsh did not get on. Two strong women clashed. And the last conversation I recall before being summarily moved to Cordova Bay School was a conversation between Mrs. Walsh and my mother that went something like this. "Mrs. Walsh, he needs to see a psychiatrist." "My mother, so do you, and if you'll go with him, I'll take him." Anyway, very quickly I was moved off to Cordova Bay, and I spent the rest of my grade 5 and grade 6 in Cordova Bay, off to Mount Newton, grade 7 and 8. I remember this is where I met Joanne's dad, Peter Thomas. I can see him to this day arriving. He was at the first PE class in grade 7. He had not been long out of the Navy, even shorter out of university. I can still see the tweed jacket that he was wearing, the flannel pants, and the white tennis shoes, and the little white English car, Morris car that he was driving. Now, having later been in the Navy and know what it means, he was pusser. And he was fair, but he was strict. And one of the things that I didn't appreciate, he had a nasty habit of writing your name on the, he taught math, of writing your name up on the blackboard if you weren't completing your assignments or doing very well. You'd see, as you walked in, names would be written on the upper left-hand corner of the blackboard. Mr. Bunnell, Industrial Arts, used to get a great kick out of him, and I think the world of what the Industrial Arts program did. I don't know how far it goes now, but it sure was a great help to me, and if they've cut it back, I'm sorry, they shouldn't have. Alan LaFleck, Mr. Bogey and Alan LaFleck. Does anybody remember Alan LaFleck? Okay, all right, so we go through grade 7 and grade 8. I'm not going to bore you with the details about that, but the first day of grade 9 comes, and I'm still at Mount Newton. And Mr. Vogey, were you there, Joan? You probably were. Mr. Vogey is down there addressing the new grade 9 class, and he stops, and he looks, and there's Alan LaFleck sitting in the class. He says, "LaFleck, are you here?" And his face just absolutely paled. And he said, "I'll see you in my office when we're done." "All right, if that's what you want," says Alan. I'll never forget that. Next thing at Mount Newton in grade 8, Hammy Hamilton. He was about grade 12. And he was much bigger and stronger than I was. And I remember one day being picked up by him by the belt and hung up on the clothes hook in the boys' washroom. And there I hung until somebody took me off. But that was Hammy Hamilton. Grades 10 and 11 were moved out to North Saanich, all living in the same house. And we end up at North Saanich going there by coach line bus to North Saanich. Royal Oak High, back 11 and 12. I told you about being the fashion plate, working at Nuns, that kind of stuff. And Mr. Murphy, who taught PE, drove a little Austin A40, a little green Austin A40. I used to go to Mount Newton with Dick Varley in his 37 Ford that just blew smoke out the back like it was a smoke machine. But by now in grade 11, I had bought from Dick Varley a 1936 Hudson Terraplane car for the princely sum of 35 bucks. And I used to drive this car to school. And also, to this day, I don't know how it was ever allowed. School administrators and lawyers today would just go berserk. We used to take the various school teams, and Murph would take them in his car, but there wasn't a lot of room. So I would quite often take 4 or 5 of the guys in my car. And we'd trundle off to Mount Newton, trundle off to North Saanich. I'd be racing to keep up with Murph or trying to pass him. And every so often, my old Hudson Terraplane would blow a great gob of brown rust out of the radiator and cover the windshield. How we got away with that without killing people and how the administration let us do that, I will never know. That's about it, really. I think I've held you up long enough, and there's other stories for other days. But thank you for listening to what I had to say. Thank you. Sure, sure. Oh, and I've got some pictures here, too, that we should pass around. Some of them, we'll just sort of circulate them. Oh, I'll hold them up first and explain what they are. This is a picture of the farm that I've talked about, basically cleared. The clearing is all basically done. So we'll pass that around. That was my Uncle Harold's place. Those were the barns and the chicken houses, where Francis Minter, by the way, lived and subdivided part of it. And Uncle Harold and Francis, my uncle, he was a bachelor, they became very good friends, particularly after her husband passed away. And he left a large part of that property to Francis. And she was able to subdivide it and do those sort of things. What I haven't talked about was the Bleithman garage, but that's for another day. And that was our house up there, and there's the strawberry patch. So you can pass that around if you like. Some of the other stuff, you can just, I was going through my mother's scrapbook, and I found these things. Enid likes this one, because this is my Uncle Stan, who was the assessor and collector, and you won't have a chance to read it, but if you guys would like that for historical records, Enid, I can easily run off a copy, and you can have it for the records of the thing. And so you can pass that around if you like, too. He was my namesake and very much a part of my life. Oh, here we are, the truck, the 36 Ford 2-ton truck, with myself and my brother and my cousin Hal on it. Here is John, who was the gardener and the star, receiving the trophy prize for the best garden in September of 1948. Here is my dad and John counting strawberries in the strawberry patch. They had a record number of strawberries. John again winning, I think, the following year, yes, with June Robbins, winning garden contests. And I told you there were 9 brothers. Well, there's 7 of them all getting together after not seeing each other for 40 years. And it was here in 1953. And here are the 9 brothers Green, not long after World War I. They were a nice-looking bunch of guys. I think they really were. I'll pass that around. And I've marked who my dad was and who Stan was and who Harold was, because they're the ones that were most concerned. And here's another one that Enid will enjoy. It's Stan Green and Ken Middleton in the assessor's office over here at the Med Grill. And here for another installment is Cadet Officer Green off on the Ontario and the Navy, who, by the way, Peter Thomas, Joanne's father, got me into, and it was probably one of the most remarkable years I've spent in my life. And here is another thing of me in Australia and the Navy. That's it. I just found them because I thought they might be interesting for you to see. So anybody got any questions, disputes, or things?
Question.
Yes?
Sir. Your father told me one day that you dressed, when you carried on with your occupation, after being a lawyer, you addressed somebody, and he referred you, I dressed down by the Beak. Can you explain that, please?
Yeah, yeah. That was when I first was appointed to judge, and it was in Duncan. And I was new at the job. I'd been a lawyer for 10 years, and I was new at the job. And anyway, I was pretty strict, I guess. I think I really mellowed as I matured on the bench. But I was pretty strict, and he was a pilferer, as I recall, a shoplifter. And I had decided that there was far too much shoplifting. It was in Nanaimo. I had decided there was far too much shoplifting going on. And so I gave him, I think I gave him 7 days right off the bat for a first offense. And everybody thought that was a pretty stiff sentence. Well, what I heard later was, and it was passed on to me, and I can't remember, I think it was by a policeman or somebody who said they'd heard a conversation on the bus about 3 or 4 weeks later with a couple of guys in the roundabouts, in the roustabouts in the bus heading to Nanaimo. And they said one to the other, or one said to the other, "Don't stop in Nanaimo. The Beak there is really tough." So I think that's where the story comes from. Yeah, yeah. I think I was aiming for a new car.
Something really bad, and he said, "Just turn your radio up and you won't hear it."
And that car drove my dad. It was a 56 Meteor V8. It drove my dad for $150,000. Ernie bought it for your uncle. And it was an amazing car. It ran just like a top. He put high detergent oil in it when I was complaining about the noise. And it ran on pretty high detergent oil for the rest of its life, compliments of your dad. And one of the things that I used to do going into town on the old road, there was the Beaver Lake. The police used to hide in the Beaver Lake access into the lake. And this was for 56, it was a pretty hot car in those days. It would go. And anyway, I'd be going into town on a hot date or something, and I'd be late, and I'd go screaming on. Well, then I'd realize, oh my God, the cops are in this road. So I'd dump her down real fast, drop her into a second, and I wouldn't hit the brakes. I'd just drop her into second so the brake lights wouldn't come on. I'd slow right down. You could see him just getting ready to go. And then for the rest of the trip into town, he'd follow me in. And I'd come to a stop sign, keeping the speed limit very carefully, and then I'd just goose it up to 30 miles an hour as fast as I could go, and then stop. And I went this way all the way into town. About 2 months later, my dad came home one night, and he was just furious. He'd been stopped by the Saanich police. He'd been harangued by this police officer, and the police officer said, "I've got you. I've got you." I didn't say a word. I said, "Really, Dad?" Yeah, yeah.
That truck picture,
Yeah.
is that one you were referring to,
Yeah.
with my mother?
Yes, that's the fenders your mother was on top of. Yes.
Some of these people haven't heard that story.
Oh gosh, well, yeah. If you've had a look at the truck, that's fine. But we used to gas up at literally the old log cabin. That's where it was. But I think, yeah, and we were still at the log cabin then. You know the old flathead V8. The fuel pumps were always going. The manual fuel pumps sat in between the two banks. And we used to always carry a spare fuel pump in the glove compartment. And it conked out one day, and we were on the spare, and we pulled into Cunningham's garage to get it fixed. And Gladys, Gary's mom, who I don't know who she was pregnant with, but she was at least 7 months or so pregnant. She was a small woman, and she was round like this. She climbs up, and she's rolling around on the front fender of this truck, changing the fuel pump in the engine. And even as a kid, I'll never forget that picture. It was unbelievable. It really was. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to me and being so attentive.